Hey there. Tonight, we are diving into the world of one of the most quietly iconic characters in video game history, Jin Sakai. Whether you've played Ghost of Tsushima, watched someone else play it, or maybe you've never seen a moment of the game before, that's perfectly okay. Tonight's story is for you. Whether you're here to remember Jin's journey, or to hear it for the very first time, gently and slowly, as you wind down for rest. So if you're ready, go ahead and settle in. Get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop, breathe in, and breathe out. The night is quiet, and this moment is just for you. Let's take a slow walk through the wind-blown golden fields of Tsushima and listen to the story of a man torn between who he was and who he needed to become. Jin Sakai was born into legacy, into duty, honor, and the way of the samurai. A warrior's path shaped by steel, ritual, and tradition. He grew up on the island of Tsushima, surrounded by swordsmanship, silence, and structure. The Sakai family was noble, respected, and feared. His father, Lord Kazumasa Sakai, was a proud samurai, unwavering and disciplined, and Jin was meant to follow in those footsteps, but nothing about Jin's path would ever be simple. Tsushima was a place of natural beauty. Rolling hills, sacred shrines, bamboo groves swaying in the wind. Jin's earliest memories were of those winds, brushing past tall grass, fluttering through the trees, whispering softly to anyone who was still enough to hear. Even as a child, there was always a part of him that listened to the wind more than to the rules. As he grew, his training became strict. Days were filled with sword drills, horseback riding, archery, and the lessons of honor. A samurai does not act from emotion. A samurai does not flee. A samurai follows the code. Jin followed, but sometimes he felt something deeper stir beneath the surface, something softer, something freer. Still, he respected his father, feared his judgment, and carried his family name like armor. Then, one day, that armor cracked. His father died, cut down in a battle that was supposed to be honorable. Jin was young. He saw it happen. He was afraid. And he ran. That moment, that choice, would echo through his life, even in dreams, even in stillness, even in peace. After his father's death, Jin was taken in and raised by his uncle, Lord Shimura, the Chitu of Tsushima, a man of patience, honor, and deep loyalty to the samurai code. Lord Shimura trained Jin as if he were his own son, molding him with care and high expectation. Under his uncle's watch, Jin grew stronger, wiser, quieter. He learned to bow properly, to strike with precision, to speak with calm. He became the perfect samurai, but the world doesn't always ask for perfection, and peace never lasts. Then came the Mongols. It was a summer unlike any other. The ocean brought a storm, not of wind or waves, but of ships. Dark, foreign, unstoppable. Khotun Khan led them, not just a warrior, but a strategist. A man who understood how to break people, not just with weapons, but with fear and manipulation. The invasion of Tsushima was brutal. Towns burned. Soldiers fell, and the samurai were shattered. Jin was there, alongside his uncle and the finest warriors of the island. They rode to the beach at Komoda, dressed in armor, blades sharpened, hearts braced. They believed in honor. They believed they could win. But honor did not stop the fire. Honor did not shield them from arrows. The Mongols fought differently, ruthlessly. Without rules. The battle was a massacre. Jin was left for dead, and his uncle was taken prisoner. The wind whispered again. But this time, it did not sound like peace. Jin awoke in the cold stillness of night. His body ached, his vision swam, and blood dried stiffly on his skin. He should have died, but he hadn't. He was pulled from the edge by unlikely hands, those of Yuna, a thief and a stranger, but also a survivor like him. Her voice was sharp, but her hands were steady. She knew the island was changing, that the code of the samurai could not win this war. And in that moment, Jin realized neither could he. Not as he was. The path ahead wasn't lit by honor, but by fire, shadow, and wind. His uncle was still alive, held captive by Khotun Khan, a symbol to be broken, and Jin knew. He would do anything to save him, even if it meant becoming something else entirely. So Jin rose, quietly, carefully. And for the first time, he walked not as a noble samurai, but as something different, something more silent than steel, something older than the code. A ghost. The island of Tsushima had become unrecognizable. Villages burned. Roads swarmed with Mongols. Innocents suffered. And still the wind whispered, pulling Jin forward. His first steps were unsteady. The way of the ghost wasn't written in books. It wasn't taught in dojos. It was instinct. It was survival. He learned to move through tall grass like wind itself, to strike from shadows, to use fear as a blade, poison, smoke, distraction. Every tool that would have once dishonored him became necessary. He watched his enemies crumble not from strength, but from silence. But with each act, a part of Jin's past self-loosened, fell away, and in its place, something else bloomed. Not shame, not guilt, but resolve. He wasn't just saving his uncle anymore. He was saving his people. Yuna stayed at his side. She saw in him something the nobles never had, the will to fight without rules when the rules were broken. Together, they freed towns, rescued prisoners, lit signals in the dark. The people of Tsushima began to whisper about the ghost, a warrior who came with the wind and vanished before the fire faded. Jin had become a legend, not in scrolls, not in shrines, but in the voices of the frightened and the brave. Yet legend always comes at a cost. When he finally reached Castle Kaneda, where Lord Shimura was being held, Jin faced Khotun Khan directly. But even as they fought, even as Jin's blade found its mark, the Khan escaped, and Jin was left with both victory and failure in his hands. His uncle was free, but the war was far from over. Lord Shimura embraced Jin, proud at first of his survival. But when the stories began to spread, of poison, of assassinations, of ambush in the night, he saw something else. He saw shame, disgrace. A samurai had not freed him, a ghost had. And ghosts, in his eyes, were beneath honor. Jin's heart broke in quiet silence. He had followed the wind. He had saved lives. He had done what others would not. But to his uncle, it wasn't enough. To the code, it was betrayal. Jin stood on the edge of the path, with honor behind him and the people ahead. He chose the people. The war escalated. Jin gathered allies. Broken men and women, cast aside by the rules. Masako, a grieving mother turned avenger. Ishikawa, a master archer burdened by loss. Noriel, a monk trying to balance peace with the blade. Kenji, a trickster with a good heart. None of them perfect, but all of them needed. The ghost gave them purpose, and together they fought, not just for Tsushima, but for the right to protect it in their own way. They struck camps, rescued slaves, dismantled the Mongols piece by piece. And everywhere they went, the people lit lanterns in the night for the ghost, not the shogun, not the samurai. The ghost. But the shogun did not light lanterns. They sent orders. And those orders were clear. Jin Sakai was to be arrested. Tried for treason. He was not a hero to them. He was a problem, a threat, a warning. And so, his uncle was given a final command. Take down the ghost, even if he is your own blood. Even if he is your son. Jin's eyes turned to the wind once more. It whispered. Not commands, not lessons, but freedom. He bowed his head in the forest and disappeared into the tall grass. The ghost had returned to the shadows, but his story was far from over. The island wept beneath the war. Autumn leaves drifted across blood-stained roads. Villagers buried their loved ones beneath silent stones. The winds that once carried song now carried sorrow, and whispers of the ghost. Jin wandered through it all, a shadow wrapped in cloth and memory. No longer riding with a proud banner, but moving quietly through the forests, through the ruins, through the breath between heartbeats. He had become something new, something Tsushima had never seen, and something the shogunate could never control. He wasn't just fighting an invasion anymore. He was preserving a soul, the soul of a land, his land. The people welcomed him not with fanfare, but with trembling hope. Farmers left offerings on shrines bearing his symbol, a broken mask, a lone fox, a single sakura blossom left on a step. They whispered prayers, not to gods, but to Jin, to the ghost, the one who would not abandon them. He accepted these gifts not with pride, but with quiet pain, because every mask offered was a reminder. He had no face to call his own anymore. One night in the hills of Omi, Jin stood beneath a withered tree, the same tree he once sat under as a child. Listening to his uncle's teachings, he remembered every word. Honor is not given. It is earned through sacrifice, through truth. And yet, truth had changed. To protect his people, he had poisoned enemy leaders. He had snuck into fortresses under moonlight. He had taken lives not in battle, but in the stillness of sleep. He had shattered the samurai code, and he was still not sorry, because he knew what that code had never understood. People did not need murderers. They needed protectors, even ghosts. Then came the final breath of war. The Khan had retreated north to the frozen mountains of Kamiagata. His forces had regrouped, fortified. The land had turned cold. Wind became ice. Fire became smoke frozen in the air. Jin followed him, not for revenge, but for closure. He rode alone across snow-covered fields. The sky hung heavy with clouds. The wind didn't whisper now, it howled, and still he did not stop. He met the Khan's army not as a warrior of honor, but as a storm. With fire, with poison, with fury and purpose. He broke their defenses. He scattered their ranks. And finally, at the icy harbor of Port Izumi, Jin faced Khotun Khan. There were no speeches, no declarations, only silence, and steel. The two men fought like shadows tearing through frost. Khotun was strength and domination, a leader who believed in control above all. Jin was loss and resistance, a ghost who fought with memory as his sword. And in the end, it was not the strongest who stood victorious, but the one who had already died 100 quiet deaths along the way. Jin's blade cut through the cold, and the Khan fell. The war was over, but Jin's battle was not. The shogun's forces arrived weeks later, not to thank him, not to honor the dead, but to restore order. Their message was simple. The ghost was a criminal, and his uncle, Lord Shimura, had been commanded to deal with him. They met beneath the falling cherry blossoms of Omi Monastery. No army, no flames. Just two men, father and son, samurai and ghost. Lord Shimura stood in full armor, his face unreadable. Jin wore no mask, only the wind. They did not raise their voices. They did not plead. They bowed, and then they drew their blades. The duel was slow, heavy, each movement filled with memory, of training, of childhood, of all the times Lord Shimura had stood behind Jin, correcting his form, guiding his sword. Now they stood opposed. Each stroke rang with grief. Each clash of steel echoed like thunder on a quiet hill. And in the end, Jin struck the final blow. Lord Shimura fell to his knees. He looked at Jin with tears in his eyes, not from pain, but from loss. He asked Jin for one final request. Give me the death of a samurai. Jin looked down. The wind was still. And in that stillness, he made a choice. He could honor the old ways and grant the request. Or he could let them end here, Let the code die. With mercy, Jin knelt before his uncle, eyes fixed on the broken lines of the elder's armor. The way the cherry blossoms clung to his shoulders like soft farewell. He heard the wind again, just barely. It moved through the petals, over the earth, brushing his hair like a memory. And he understood. It was not only calling him forward, it was asking him to choose. To be the man he was raised to be, or the one he had become. Jin closed his eyes, and with a hand that trembled only slightly, he lowered his blade. He did not grant his uncle death. He gave him mercy. A quiet, agonizing mercy that carried the weight of all their years together. Lord Shimura, once so proud and composed, turned his face away, not in anger, but in grief deeper than words. His honor was torn, his name cast in shadow, not by a Mongol, but by the boy he had called son. But Jin knew to kill him would be to betray everything he had come to understand. The code of the samurai had not saved Tsushima. Love had, loss had, the people had, and mercy was the only true end to violence. Jin walked away from that hill alone. No title, no land, no family, only the wind to follow. And so the ghost disappeared once more. Seasons passed, the fires faded, and Tsushima began to heal. Slowly, painfully, like new shoots growing through ashes. Villages rebuilt, rice fields returned. Children played in roads once scorched by war, but even in peace, they whispered of him. They said he still walked the island at night, that foxes followed his path, that flowers bloomed where his feet touched soil, that he rode beneath moonlight, watching, waiting, listening. The ghost of Tsushima, not a man, but a promise, that someone would always protect them. Jin lived quietly, hidden deep in the forests he once rode through with purpose. No longer a lord, no longer a warrior of the shogun, just a man. A gardener of silence, a friend to the animals, a shadow beneath the trees. Sometimes he would speak aloud to the wind, to his father, to Taka, to Yuna, to the fallen. He did not ask for answers, only presence. And in the rustling leaves, in the stillness of dusk, they answered, not in words, but in peace. At shrines and temples, travelers still left small offerings. A mask carved from wood, a folded leaf tied with red thread, a single stone balanced carefully atop another, symbols of quiet gratitude, of protection that came unseen. Jin never claimed them, but he saw them. And in those simple tributes, he knew that his story, the one he had lived and lost and carried, had become something more. Not a legend of victory, not a tale of power, but a bedtime story, told by mothers to frighten children. Sleep now, little one. The ghost watches over us. And in that story, he found rest. There was a hidden place far from roads and shrines, tucked deep between the cedar trees and winding streams of northern Tsushima. This is where Jin made his home. A small house, nothing grand, nothing noble. A single room of worn wood and flickering candlelight. A fire pit, a straw mat, a teapot older than memory. A place not of war, but of stillness. He spent his mornings tending a small garden. Radishes, wild greens. A few yellow chrysanthemums, grown not for eating, but for remembering. He liked the way they faced the light. Sometimes he would kneel by the stream nearby and watch the water pass, slowly, steadily, without resistance. He listened to it, not for words, but for rhythm, for peace. Jin still kept his sword. It rested by the door, wrapped in cloth, untouched for days at a time. He no longer needed to draw it, but he never forgot the weight of it, the lives it had taken, the lives it had saved. The sword was no longer a weapon. It was a memory, heavy and silent. Just like him, on certain nights, when the mist rolled through the valley and the moon hung low like a pale lantern in the sky, Jin would take a quiet ride on his horse. Not fast, not far. Just a slow walk through the woods, the creak of the saddle the only sound. He had named his horse Kaze, which meant wind, a quiet echo of the force that had guided him all his life. Kaz was not the steed he had once ridden into battle. She was older, gentler, but she carried him without hesitation, as if she too remembered what it meant to be part of something larger than the path beneath their feet. One evening, as Jin approached a narrow cliffside path overlooking the ocean, he dismounted and stood barefoot on the edge. The waves below whispered to the rocks like old friends. The horizon stretched endlessly forward, blue and silver and full of dreams. He thought of his mother, her voice soft and sweet like plum wine, telling stories by candlelight. He thought of his father, the firm hands, the proud eyes, the words spoken not with warmth, but with expectation. He thought of Yuna, the fire in her heart, the way she had never bowed to fear, the way she had taught him to live beyond the code. And he thought of Lord Shimura, his second father, his greatest disappointment, his deepest sorrow. Jin closed his eyes, and he whispered one word, "Thank you." He didn't say it to any one person. He said it to the wind, to the lives he had touched, to the lives that had touched him, to the island that had shaped him. And as the breeze lifted his hair gently, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not pride, not pain, but peace. True, quiet peace. He did not need to be remembered. He did not need statues or shrines or stories carved in stone. He had lived, he had fought, he had protected what he loved. And now, he simply existed, a man once called Ghost, now just Jin. The seasons passed gently. Autumn fell in slow amber spirals, followed by the soft hush of winter. Snow gathered on the roof of Jin's quiet home, muffling the world into stillness. The birds disappeared, the stream ran slower, the nights became longer, and Jin remained. He moved less often during the cold, wrapping himself in thick cloth, sleeping near the fire, rising only when the sky turned soft with pale morning light. He had learned to live without the urgency of battle, without the rhythm of sword and blood and war drums. Now, his days followed a different rhythm. The crackle of fire, the rustle of leaves, the breath in his chest, and the breath leaving it. There was comfort in simplicity, comfort in silence. Sometimes travelers would find their way to his little house. Not many, only those who had heard the whispers and followed the old paths through the woods. Some were children chasing legends. Others were warriors seeking something they had lost. Jin never turned them away. He would offer them tea, a warm mat, and stories, not of war or conquest, but of foxes and fallen leaves, of the first time he tasted plum wine, or the way the wind always knew which path to take. They listened, and when they left changed. Not because they had met the ghost, but because they had met the man who had become peace itself. One day, a young boy arrived, barefoot, tired, but eyes full of wonder. He had heard of Jin from his grandfather, how a masked warrior had saved their village many years ago, how he moved like shadow and struck like lightning, how he had vanished before the sun rose. The boy looked at Jin's weathered face, his soft hands now calloused only by soil, not steel. "You're not what I expected," he said. Jin smiled, a slow, quiet smile that held more truth than any blade ever could. "Neither was I," he replied. The boy stayed the night, sleeping beside the fire, curled beneath a worn blanket, and in the morning, Jin showed him how to follow the wind. They walked through the forest, feet soft on moss, voices low. Jin pointed out the fox dens, the old shrines nearly forgotten by time, the flowers that only bloomed where no one dared to look. He taught the boy to listen, not just with his ears, but with his breath, with his skin, with his stillness. "There is a voice in all things," he said, "even in the quiet." The boy nodded. He didn't ask questions. He simply watched. And Jin saw, in the way his eyes lingered on the smallest flutter of a leaf, that the lesson had already taken root. When the boy left, he bowed deeply, not like a samurai, but like someone saying thank you to the world. Jin watched him disappear down the path, the same way he had once disappeared from the world of honor and war. And as the wind carried the boy's footprints away, Jin returned to his garden, to the quiet, to himself. Spring came quietly, one petal at a time. First, the ice melted along the stream. Then came the birds, their songs soft and unfamiliar after months of stillness. Buds appeared on the trees, pink and white and new. The world, once again, remembered how to breathe. So did Jin. He stepped outside barefoot, letting the morning dew kiss the soles of his feet. The earth was cold, but it welcomed him. The light in the sky was gentle, not yet sharp, like a hand brushing hair from a loved one's face. Jin looked out over the valley, mist curling between branches, wildflowers waking up in slow motion. It was beautiful, but more than that, it was alive. He returned to his routine slowly. He gathered herbs, not for poison, but for healing. He mended his roof, patched his cloak, sanded the handle of his old teapot until it felt like smooth river stone. There was no need to hurry. Everything that had once rushed inside him, the urgency, the battle rhythm, the iron pulse of war, was now distant, like the echo of a gong long faded into silence. He had not forgotten who he had been, but he no longer needed to carry it like armor. He had made peace with his past, and peace was heavier than any sword. Some days, he wrote, not letters, not records, but moments. He would take an old brush, dip it into ink, and let memory move through his hands. He wrote of rice fields in the wind, of foxes with eyes like glowing coals, of the sound of waves crashing against Komoda Beach on a summer morning before the world changed. He did not write names, not even his own. These stories were not for fame, they were for release, like breathing out after holding your breath for years. The villagers began to visit more often, though not to ask for help. They brought food, warm cloth, small gifts, mostly as excuses to sit near the fire and hear Jin's voice. He didn't speak often, but when he did, it was always slow, thoughtful, soft. He would speak of kindness, not as a rule, but as a habit. He would speak of bravery, not as battle, but as honesty and silence. And most of all, he would speak of the wind. How it carried you, how it remembered, how it never stopped moving, even when no one was watching. One evening, after a rainstorm, Jin stood in the open doorway, watching the last of the drops slide from the eaves. The sky was streaked with peach and gold, and the air smelled like wet pine and fresh earth. In the distance, he heard the soft cry of a crane taking flight. And for the first time in weeks, he whispered aloud, "I'm still here," not to anyone. Not even to himself, but to the world, to the wind. And the wind, as always, whispered back. Time became something soft. Not a clock, not a march, but a drift. A pedal carried on water. A quiet footfall through damp grass. Days slipped into one another like silk. Jin no longer marked them by calendars or seasons, but by smells, by sounds, by the way the shadows leaned in the late afternoon. He began to dream more often. Not the sharp dreams of battle or blood. Those had faded, worn smooth by years of silence, but long, drifting dreams. Dreams of riding through golden fields, of sparring with his uncle beneath autumn trees, of riding through mist with a younger Yuna at his side, her laughter rising like birds into the morning. Sometimes he would wake and forget where he was. Not out of confusion, but peace, because the world in his dreams was not so different from the one he had now, just quieter and just as kind. On one such morning, Jin woke before the sun, the sky still a soft blue shadow above the trees. The air was warm with coming rain, and the wind brought the scent of sea salt from the southern cliffs. He boiled tea slowly, with hands that moved more carefully now. And as he sat on the porch, cup in hand, he felt something he had never truly known in his younger years. Stillness, not the stillness of waiting, but the stillness of being. Nothing chasing him, nothing behind him, nothing needing to be done. Just the warmth of the tea, the whisper of the wind, and the slow, steady rhythm of his breath. He remembered something Yuna once said long ago, a passing thought by a dying fire. Maybe peace isn't something we find. Maybe it's something we build, one quiet moment at a time. Back then, he hadn't understood. He was still searching for it then, as if peace were a sword he could win, a fortress he could take. But now, he saw, she had been right. Peace was not a gift given. It was a practice, a place, a choice. And every time he knelt by his garden, every time he let a fox curl beside him without fear, every time he breathed without armor, he was building it, brick by silent brick. Later that day, as the rain finally came, Jin stood at the doorway again, watching the droplets fall through light. Everything glistened. The world had washed itself clean. And in that silver hush, a memory stirred, not of war, not of blood, but of his mother, humming softly to herself as she painted, her brush moving like wind over silk. He could still see her hands, steady, gentle, bringing life to the page. He remembered sitting beside her, quiet, watching, learning not to paint, but to listen, to hold space, to be present. And now, after everything, after all the fire and fury, he realized that this, more than any sword or lesson, had been her greatest gift, presence. And so he returned inside, lit a candle, unrolled a fresh scroll, and began to paint. Not for perfection, not for legacy, but for the stillness it brought. The brush moved slowly across the rice paper, each stroke deliberate yet weightless, like the passing of time. Jin didn't paint with grand intention. He didn't seek beauty. He didn't care for perfection. What he painted were moments. A fox curled beneath a maple, a crow on a branch just before it took flight, the reflection of the moon caught in a bowl of water. Each one drawn not from imagination, but from memory. Small things he had noticed when he allowed himself to truly see the world. And as the ink settled into the fibers of the page, Jin felt something loosen in his chest. A quiet untying of the last few knots he hadn't even realized were still there. The act of creation became a form of meditation. And in that stillness, he let go of the war all over again. There were no visitors that week, no letters, no travelers. Only wind and quiet, and rain that came each afternoon like a blessing. Jin welcomed the solitude, not as isolation, but as company. He spent his days beneath the eaves of his porch, watching the storm move through the forest. Leaves danced like spirits, mist curled through the trees, and the earth, wet and dark, smelled like forgiveness. He no longer feared silence. In fact, he had grown to cherish it, because silence, he had learned, wasn't emptiness. It was a canvas, and his life had become the brush. He thought often of the people who had once walked beside him. Yuna, fierce, brilliant, unbreakable. Misako, wounded but unwavering, a storm in human form. Ishikawa, prideful, flawed, but full of purpose. Noriel, Kenji, Taka, Yuriko. Each of them had carried the war in their own way. Each of them had paid a price, and yet they had all survived within him. Jin had outlived the war, yes, but more than that, he had carried its memory with grace, not as a burden, but as a thread, delicate, long, and unbroken. And now that thread wove into the quiet days of his life like golden thread and silk. One morning, Jin found a new flower growing beside the path near his home. It hadn't been there before, at least not in bloom. It was tall, slender, with petals of soft lavender and white, delicate, unassuming, but it held its head high. He knelt beside it and smiled, touching one petal gently with the tip of his finger. It swayed, not from his hand, but from the breeze. He didn't know its name, but he bowed to it anyway, because he understood things could grow from ashes, soft things, strong things, even after all that had burned. That evening, Jin sat on the porch again, a warm cup of tea cradled between his palms. The sky above Tsushima had turned to deep indigo, with the last streaks of golden light slipping beneath the horizon. Crickets had begun their soft song, rising and falling like gentle waves on a forgotten shore. He took a slow sip, let the steam curl against his face, and closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but to feel, to notice the way the breeze touched his skin, to hear the whisper of bamboo creaking nearby, to breathe deeply in rhythm with the earth itself. The world had grown quieter, yes, but Jin had come to understand something about silence. It was not the absence of sound. It was a space, a wide, sacred space where truth could speak softly and be heard. He had filled his life with those spaces now, left room between each chore, between each thought, for nothing at all. It was in that nothingness that he found everything. When the villagers returned, they brought news of a new generation training at the old dojos, of children playing make-believe, pretending to be the ghost, sneaking through tall grass, ambushing invisible Mongols, whispering to the wind. Some wore masks made from bark and string. Others painted theirs white, with red strokes across the eyes. They didn't fully understand what they were imitating, but that was all right, because their play was not born of fear, but of reverence, of stories passed quietly from mother to child, from elder to youth, around fires and under blankets. The ghost had become more than Jin. He had become a guardian spirit of the island. Jin listened with a warm heart. He never corrected them, never claimed the title. He only smiled, bowed his head, and placed another log gently into the fire. Let them have their ghost. Let them believe he still rode the wind, unseen but ever near. In a way, he did. On the first day of summer, the lotus pond near Jin's home bloomed. The green pads floated like tiny islands, the white blossoms glowing in the morning light. Jin walked there barefoot, alone, his reflection rippling gently across the water. He thought of how far he had come, not in distance, but in being. From the proud heir of Clan Sakai, to the broken warrior, to the exile, and finally to this, a quiet man at peace with his shadow. He crouched by the water's edge and whispered to it, "Thank you for waiting." He didn't expect an answer, but the breeze stirred the reeds just enough to let him know. It hurt him. As the days stretched into the heart of summer, Jin began waking earlier, long before the first birds stirred in the trees, before the dew left the grass. There was something sacred about those hours before the world remembered itself. He would sit with his tea, wrapped in his lightest cloak, and watch the eastern horizon begin to glow, a soft blue at first, then pale rose, then golden flame on the lips of the clouds. No music, no voices, only the slow rising breath of the earth itself. The beginning of day as it was meant to be witnessed in reverence. It was in these quiet dawns that Jin did most of his thinking, not about what had been. He had long since made peace with the ghosts of Komoda Beach, the screams of the dying, the broken mask he once wore. No, his thoughts now wandered toward the question that all warriors, in the end, must face. What remains when the battle is over? And the answer, gentle as rain on a pond, came not in a voice, but in presence. What remains is care. The careful tending of life. The care between strangers who become neighbors. The care in passing knowledge, in guarding peace, in planting for tomorrow, even if you won't see the bloom. That was his legacy now. Not the blade, but the hand that could still open, still give. One day, a traveler arrived, an old samurai who had once served under Shimura's banner. His armor was dusty and sun-bleached, his face lined with years, but his eyes, sharp and searching, had not aged at all. He bowed deeply to Jin, and Jin, without ceremony, bowed back. The man stayed 3 nights. They did not speak of war. Instead, they worked in silence, mending the garden fence, repairing the cracked well stone, walking beneath the cypress trees in the evenings. On the final morning, the man left a small offering by the gate, a strip of blue cloth from his old uniform tied neatly around a bamboo shoot. No words, no farewell, just a gesture. And in that simple act, Jin felt more honored than in all his years among the nobles. Tsushima had changed. And Jin had changed with it. He was no longer the wind's blade. He had become its whisper. There were days when pain would return, not emotional, but physical. The slow ache in his joints, the stiffness in his sword hand, now used more for lifting baskets than for drawing steel. Age had caught up to him, but he did not resent it. Each ache was a reminder of survival, of long nights kept warm by the fire, of mornings kissed by the mist. He moved slower now, not out of weakness, but mindfulness. Every step was considered, every motion graceful in its economy. And in that slowness, there was depth. Autumn returned once more, cloaking the hills of Tsushima in amber and fire. The air turned crisp. The winds carried the scent of cedar and sweet fallen leaves. Birds gathered in flocks overhead, calling softly to each other as they prepared for their journey across the sea. Jin wrapped himself in a warmer robe, the same one Yuriko had once mended for him during the war. Its edges were frayed now, its color faded, but it carried the scent of pine needles and ink and time. Like so much in his life, it had softened with age, and in that softness, it had become beautiful. He found himself reflecting more often, not as a man longing for the past, but as someone remembering a long walk through the mountains. He thought about the journey, every valley crossed, every storm endured, every moment where he thought he might not go on. And yet, here he was, still walking, still breathing, still surrounded by the wind. The villagers brought offerings for the autumn harvest, small bowls of rice, freshly picked mushrooms, persimmons wrapped in cloth, not as tribute, but as thanks. They came not to worship a legend, but to care for a neighbor. Some brought children with them, who sat shyly near the fire, eyes wide, waiting for Jin to speak. He rarely told stories of the war anymore. Instead, he told them about the foxes, about how they led him to shrines, how they watched from the trees, how sometimes, if you left a small offering, they would guard your dreams while you slept. The children believed every word. And Jin, he wasn't sure they were just stories either. One boy asked him, "Were you scared back then?" Jin paused, then nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. All the time, the boy's face wrinkled in confusion. "But you were the ghost." Jin smiled. The ghost was scared too. The fire cracked softly between them. Outside, a breeze rustled the bamboo. Jin reached over and gently tapped the boy's chest. "Courage isn't having no fear," he whispered. "It's carrying it. And walking anyway." The boy sat very still, and Jin could tell that those words had taken root, just as others had taken root in him long ago. That night, long after the visitors had gone, Jin walked the edge of the forest. He carried a lantern, more for tradition than need. The moon was full, casting silver across every leaf, every path, every tree. The world glowed, not with fire, but with calm. He paused beside a small shrine tucked beneath the roots of an old oak. He bowed once, not for anyone in particular, but for everyone, for the fallen, for the living, for the wind. Winter crept in without fanfare. One morning, Jin stepped outside and saw his breath rise in pale clouds. The garden was dusted with frost, the pond frozen in its stillest places. Even the trees stood quiet, bare and listening. He gathered firewood that day, slower than he once did. Each log carried with care, stacked mindfully by the hearth. He lit the fire not just for warmth, but as ritual. The flame was a companion, a quiet one, and its flicker reminded him of things worth tending. The snow began to fall not long after, soft, dry flakes that tumbled from the sky like memories. Jin sat near the window, wrapped in his robe, a blanket folded across his knees. He didn't move much on those cold days. His body asked for rest, and he listened. After a lifetime of fighting, of fleeing, of chasing, of enduring, he had earned the quiet. He watched the forest change beneath the snow. Fox prints, light and fast, would sometimes dance across his doorstep. A lone crane visited the frozen stream each morning, standing still, head tilted toward the wind. And each day, Jin would bow to it from the porch, not because he expected anything in return, but because the crane and its quiet resilience was sacred. Like everything else in this life he had come to love. He spent long hours near the fire, sipping tea, painting slowly. Each stroke was slower now, his hands not as sure, his fingers sometimes trembling with cold, but the images came still. A single reed in snow, the shadow of a bird in flight, the slope of a mountain beneath twilight. He no longer kept his paintings. He would burn them after a day or two, not out of shame or secrecy, but release. Art, like breath, did not need to remain. It only needed to be offered. And so he offered it to the flame, to the silence, to the moment. One evening, as the snow thickened and the wind howled low through the trees, Jin dreamed of Komoda Beach, but not the invasion. Not fire, not death. He dreamed of the day before, of watching the sunrise over the waves, of brushing his horse's mane, of Lord Shimura placing a hand on his shoulder, silent but warm. And when he woke, he found himself smiling, because for once, the memory had returned without pain. The snow fell heavier that night, and Jin, wrapped in wool and warmth, lay by the fire and whispered, "I'm not afraid. Not of sleep, not of forgetting, not even of the end, because he had lived, truly lived. He had known love and sorrow and purpose and peace, all in one lifetime, all within one heart." The next morning arrived silver and slow. Snow blanketed the forest in quiet, its weight softening every edge of the world. The trees bowed beneath it, the rooftops were like silk. Even the air moved slower, reverent in its hush. Inside his small home, Jin stirred, not suddenly, not with urgency. Just a quiet shift beneath his blanket, a breath, a blink. The stillness of a man who knew there was nothing he had left undone. He sat up and poured a cup of tea. His hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from time. Time had always been his truest companion. And now, at the edge of one life and the soft beginning of whatever came after, he welcomed it fully. The fire crackled, and Jin closed his eyes. He could still feel the wind brushing his cheek, though the windows were closed. He could still hear the footsteps of a fox in the snow, though the path outside lay empty. He could still taste the plum wine from Yuriko's garden, still smell the salted edge of the southern coast, still feel the thrum of his heartbeat as he rode into battle one last time beside Yuna. But more than anything, he felt the stillness, that soft, final stillness he had searched for across a lifetime of war. It had always been here, waiting. That afternoon, the snow paused just long enough for the sun to break through. A shaft of golden light stretched across the floorboards, and Jin stepped into it, barefoot, shoulders loose, his breath clouding gently in the air. He sat beneath it, knees crossed, hands resting in his lap. Not meditating, not sleeping, just being. He looked around his home one last time, the empty cup on the table, the scroll on the wall, painted with a single plum blossom, the katana near the door, wrapped in cloth, resting like a memory. And then he closed his eyes again and listened to the wind, to the silence, to the end. Evening came slowly. No one saw him go. But when a young traveler arrived 2 days later, bringing rice and stories from the village, he found Jin seated peacefully, his face still and soft, as if he had merely dozed off beside the fire. The boy did not cry. He knelt, bowed deeply, and lit a new flame in the hearth, just as Jin would have. Then he stepped outside into the falling snow and whispered the words that would echo across the island for generations to come. The ghost sleeps now, but the wind still watches. Word of Jin's passing spread slowly like the wind itself. Not shouted, not carved into stone, but whispered. Through forests and villages, across shrines and coastlines, and voices that bent low with reverence. They said he had faded in silence, that he had chosen his moment, that he had heard the wind one final time and let go. And though he had no grand funeral, no ceremony with banners and incense, people came, one by one, to the little house near the trees. They came not to mourn a warrior, but to thank a guardian. Someone swept the porch, someone else fed the foxes. Children gathered pebbles and placed them in a line near the gate, a quiet game Jin had once taught them. Inside, the fire was kept burning, not because anyone was cold, but because the warmth had become part of the place itself. Jin had not left behind gold or armor, or a name etched into wood, but he had left behind a rhythm, a way of moving through the world that others could feel. In every soft step, every act of care, every moment where a person chose peace instead of pride. And so a story grew, not one of war, but one of healing. Of the man who walked alone into the woods and came out no longer a samurai, no longer a ghost, but something quieter, something whole. Years passed. The house was never abandoned. It was kept simple as he had left it. The garden tended, the roof mended, the gate left open to wind and foxes alike. Some said the wind moved differently there, that if you stood very still, you could hear it say his name. Not Jin, not Ghost, but a name older than both. A name made only of breath and sky. And on certain nights, when the moon is high and the crickets hush, you might see a figure walking through the trees. A man, or perhaps a memory, his hair pulled back, his robes swaying in rhythm with the earth. He carries no sword, only silence. And he leaves no footprints, only calm. So now, as you rest, feel the wind move across your own breath. Feel the silence between your thoughts. And know that somewhere in the stillest corners of the world, Jin Sakai walks on, not as the ghost, not as a warrior, but as peace itself, soft, enduring, and always near. And thank you for sharing this long, peaceful journey. Jin's story, told this way, becomes not only a tale of war and redemption, but a lullaby for the soul.